Hey everybody, how are you doing? I hope you're well and your studies are going comparatively smoothly. Because the focus of today's video is the skill of comparison, and it's one that I think a lot of students forget about. You need to be able to do it not just when you're comparing approaches on paper 2, although that's obviously the most common way, but you need to be able to do it potentially across the whole specification. Alright, so let's crack on. Okay, so what is comparison? Let's start there. Well, AQA have this quite handy list, if you haven't found it, it might be worth having a look at, of command words on their website. And compare, they say, is to identify similarities and or differences. I'm not sure that's the most helpful definition, to be honest, considering identify, I think in the exam papers I tend to associate with the idea of just sort of stating, where, you know, high-level comparison marks are not just going to be stating. But anyway, it's about similarities and differences. What do you talk about? Well, I think it depends on what you're doing. So if you're comparing theories or concepts, it could be about their key features or sort of assumptions of theories. It could be that you compare things in terms of their implications, so how ethical they are, how economic they are, do they lead to treatments, do they have real-world application, that sort of stuff. It could be that you compare in terms of how scientific they are. Issues and debates, though, is probably one of the most useful ways of comparing things, particularly for your approaches, so bear that in mind, okay? Okay, so let's start off with this question. Explain one difference between the cognitive approach and the biological approach. This could be interactive, you could pause it here and give it a go if you like, otherwise I'm just going to carry on, so don't let me stop you practicing though, okay? So, I think the first thing to say is that I do have a comparison video already in my Skills for Psychology playlist. So you could go and watch that if you like, but really the main point is what I've put on the screen there. In terms of writing your paragraphs, then what I would suggest you do is you start off by making the theme of the paragraph really clear, so what is the similarity or difference, and then you explain how both things sort of fit into that, or what they've got to say about it, yeah? And I would advise, if you're aiming for top grades, for top levels, you then sort of make a judgment or bring that back together in some way, okay? So let's see what that could look like. Obviously, there's loads of different things you could talk about here for differences between these two approaches. I'm just going with one example, and I'm going with determinism. So, one difference between the cognitive and the biological approaches is their stance on determinism. That's my theme, that's my point, okay? The cognitive approach argues that whilst behaviour is shaped by how we process information, we're able to make conscious decisions. So that's the point, we can make conscious decisions there. That's what the cognitive approach says about it. They're not hard determinists, yeah? In contrast, the biological approach views behaviour as caused by factors such as genetics and neurochemistry, taking a hard determinist view. So there's the difference, isn't it? One's hard determinist, one's probably more soft, isn't it? Let's bring it back together. Therefore, the biological approach is more determinist than the cognitive approach. So that judgment at the end there, that's comparative as well, look, because I've used the language more determinist. All right, that's how I would do that. That's 3 marks. Okay, so we're going to stick with paper 2, but we're going to move over to look at biopsychology this time, methods of studying the brain. Again, feel free to pause it, give it a go and come back. Don't let me stop you doing that. Otherwise, let's crack on. So, I think for 6 marks here, I'd be looking for 2 points, 2 paragraphs. I may do a similarity and a difference. We'll see what comes out. Okay, so the first point I'm going to go with is about how they actually work. So one difference between fMRI and EEG is the nature of their measurement of brain activity. fMRI uses blood oxygenation levels, which is an indirect measure of neural communication. In contrast, so there's comparative language there, look, EEG uses electrodes to record impulses. I'm going to bring it back together now. Therefore, EEG is a much more direct measure of brain activity, arguably making it more valid than fMRI. Again, look at the comparative language that I'm putting in there. Second point, a further difference is their spatial resolution. Since EEG uses electrodes, its recordings include activity from thousands of nearby neurons, making it inappropriate for studying small regions. In contrast, fMRI has far greater resolution, allowing the investigation of much smaller areas and regions below the surface of the brain. Let's bring it back together. Arguably, this makes fMRI more accurate and therefore more useful for pinpointing the functions of specific brain regions. So in the first paragraph, I'm sort of saying EEG is better because it's more direct. In the second, I'm saying fMRI is better for this specific job. So there's pros and cons. That's why we're comparing them. That's why there's more than one technique, right? Okay, so Again, just going back to the guidance, the structure there, look at how I've put this together. I've made a clear point. I've signposted the theme to the examiner. I've talked about what fMRI does and what EEG does. I've brought it back together with some comparative language in my judgment. And I've done the same thing again in the second paragraph. Okay, so once you're used to this structure and you sort of have got a bit of a grasp about the kinds of things to talk about, I think you'll be fine. Okay, this time we're going to go back to approaches, and the question is outline key features of social learning theory. Compare social learning theory with the humanistic approach for 8 marks. Okay, when I think 8 marks, I like to think in terms of how much am I writing, what's it going to look like on the page. So for an 8 marker, I'd be writing, it does depend on the size of your writing, I suppose, but I'd be writing about a side and maybe 1 paragraph, so about a third of a page on the outline, and then 2 reflecting the balance between AO1 and AO3. So it'll be 3 plus 5 for knowledge and comparison. Okay, my outline would be outlining some of the key assumptions, remembering my specialist terminology. So I might be thinking about vicarious reinforcement, I might be thinking about reciprocal determinism, mediational processes, identification, imitation modelling. There's so much there. I wouldn't be including everything. I'm going to try and get that balance between breadth and depth. In terms of comparison, like I said, probably 2 points would be all right. And I think I would be potentially choosing from a couple of these. So maybe talk about the role of both internal and external factors. Both approaches seem to do that. With humanistic psychology, you've got the role of other people in terms of, if people are giving you conditions of worth, that's an external thing. The internal thing might be that drive to self-actualize. So it recognizes both of that side of stuff. And social learning theory, I guess you've got that mediational processes, things like attention and retention, that's internal, and the external stuff coming from things like vicarious reinforcement. So both approaches acknowledge a range of factors. That could be a comparison point. It could be that actually I might write a paragraph about how scientific they are, and I might be talking about how the social learning theory is actually much more scientific, and maybe bringing in my knowledge of the fact that Albert Bandura did controlled lab experiments. Or I might decide actually I'm going to do a discussion on, or a comparison on, determinism and talk about how the humanistic approach focuses on free will, whereas social learning theory is more determinist. Maybe it's soft determinism because Bandura did say that people can actively sort of have an impact on their environment. That was the idea of reciprocal determinism. So we can affect our environment and also that can affect us. So yeah, that would be potentially a way of dealing with that 8 marker. And since the focus so far has been on paper 2, and research methods is part of paper 2, that feels like a good segue for me to mention the fact that I've got a research methods practice questions book available now on Amazon. So each page or each set of questions comes with a stem, a bit like you would see in the exam, and then a mix of questions for you to apply your knowledge of research methods. They all come with suggested answers that I've written at the back of the book. I hope that's useful. I apologise for taking 30 seconds out of the video, but let's crack on now. Alright, here's another one for you. So again, you could pause the video, and I'm not saying that you need to sit for 20-25 minutes and have a full go at this, although you could do that, that'd be really good. It might be worth even just taking 2 minutes to pause it and do a bit of a blur, a bit of a mind map, a bit of a plan, and then come back and listen to me, if you can stomach it. So, there you go. There was your chance to pause it. Outline the behaviorist approach, compare the behaviorist approach with the psychodynamic approach. Okay, right, let's pick it apart. 16 marks. Command word is outline. Command word is also compare. So your AO1 and your AO3, 6 for outline, 10 for compare. Notice there's no evaluation as such there, it's comparison, the skill that's being assessed. And notice as well, because I guarantee that some people will miss out on this, it says outline the behaviorist approach. So the 6 knowledge marks are just for behaviorism. The psychodynamic stuff, don't bother outlining that. You're going to bring that in later in your comparison. Yeah? Okay, so 6 and 10. I like to think about what it would look like on the page, as I said, and I'd normally write 2, maybe 2.5 sides for a 16 marker, probably half a page or so of the knowledge, the AO1, and then probably 3 comparison paragraphs, but if I got to the end of the third one and I thought actually maybe one of them was a bit brief, then I probably would try and add another one, but we'll have to see how it goes. Okay, so we talked about the two skills and the mark allocation. In terms of the outline of the behaviorist approach, you're talking about the key assumptions, things like maybe it's about the role of the environment, the role of learning. We might talk about the idea of tabula rasa, or how the behaviorist approach is working under the assumption that we're born blank slate. You might talk about the role of animal research, how behaviorists recognise no dividing line between man and beast, so we can generalise. You're going to talk probably about the work of Pavlov and Skinner, their research, the principles that they discovered and developed. You might talk about the role of just beyond the idea of classical conditioning in terms of UCS and CS and that sort of stuff. You might talk about the role of timing, extinction. You might talk about stimulus generalization, spontaneous recovery. For operant conditioning, you might add in the ideas of schedules of reinforcement, talking about continuous or variable or partial schedules. You don't have to do all of this. It's just possible things that you could talk about to get that breadth and depth, as well as impress the examiner with your specialist terminology. Okay, we're then going to write 3, possibly 4 comparison paragraphs. Potentially you would talk about the scientific nature of the behaviorist approach in comparison with the psychodynamic approach and how that one fails to meet certain features of science. You could do a comparison paragraph on determinism, because they're both determinist, aren't they really, in their own way, but there's a slight difference in how they are determinists. And you could do a bit of a discussion about nature-nurture potentially, because behaviorism is very much on the nurture end of things, whereas psychodynamic probably does a bit of both. But it's up to you. There are lots of different ideas that I'm sure you'll have. That's what I'm going with, because that's what came to mind for me first. So let's look at the outline. I cannot possibly put a whole 60 marker on one screen for you, but we'll break it down. Let's look at the outline first. So I'm saying the behaviorist approach focuses on the idea that behavior is shaped by the environment. That's nurture. Viewing babies as blank slates. According to this approach, behavior is a result of learned associations, classical conditioning, and consequences, operant conditioning. For example, when a desirable consequence follows behavior, it's more likely to be repeated, whether this is the addition of a pleasant stimulus, positive reinforcement, or the removal of an aversive one, negative reinforcement. In contrast, when an undesirable consequence follows behavior, it's less likely to be repeated, punishment. So what I've done so far there is talk through some of the key principles and ideas associated with behaviorism. Particularly, I'll focus more on operant conditioning there. I'm going to go on and I'm going to talk more generally now about the approach. So a core feature of behaviorism is that psychology should be conducted using scientific principles. Indeed, conditioning principles were discovered through the systematic controlled lab work of Pavlov, who discovered that dogs' salivary reflex, which is an unconditioned response to food, could be triggered by sound after association of food with the sound of a bell, which was a neutral stimulus. So what I've done there is I've linked in my knowledge of Pavlov's research to the idea of how scientific the behaviorist approach is. And what I've also done is linked his research into explaining how classical conditioning works. I feel like there is so much that you could say here. I'm trying to be efficient. I'm trying to embed things and kind of get 2 birds with 1 stone, I suppose, with some of what I'm saying here. So I'm showing the examiner that I know all of this stuff, but I'm not going to write a whole page just talking about how the UCS is paired with the NS and it becomes a C and all of that, because although that is relevant, it's not really fully answering the question. If I spend all my time doing that, I'm not going to get to all the juicy bits. So that's why I've chosen to do what I've done there. Okay, where are we? And Skinner, who developed the Skinner box to investigate operant conditioning principles on rats and pigeons, later discovering the role of schedules, which is the importance of timing of reinforcement. So again, I could have gone further there and explained the different types of schedule, but I felt like I've already got enough there, and I've got loads of specialist terminology already in this response. I'm not going to explain positive and negative reinforcement and punishment again, because I've already done that. Okay, last bit. The behaviorist approach also sees little difference between human and animal behaviour. As noted, it relies heavily on research on learning in birds and mammals, making generalisations to humans. So again, I've linked in what Pavlov and Skinner have done, and I've linked that generally to the approach. A key assumption of the approach is that we can generalise from animals. Okay, I'm not saying that's the only way to outline the behaviorist approach. I'm just saying that I've got a good coverage there of the key principles. All right, so that's my outline. And we're now on to looking at some comparison. So again, I'll break this down a bit. A reminder there of my suggested structure for writing comparison. I'm going to start off with a difference here. So one difference between them is their stance on the scientific method. So that's my theme. That's clearly sort of signposted for the examiner. As noted earlier, so I'm linking back to what I'd already said, behaviorists such as Pavlov and Skinner use lab methods, enabling control and replicability, and focused on observable, measurable phenomena such as salivation, adding to the objectivity of the approach. So this probably sounds quite like evaluation, because in a way it's quite a similar skill, but I'm using my evaluation a bit like I did on one of the earlier questions. I'm using my evaluation skills to compare. So in contrast, the psychodynamic approach often uses a case study approach, such as in Freud's analysis of Little Hans. You might remember him, that was the horse one. Drawing subjective interpretations from dreams and word associations. You could mention the Rorschach tests there if you're aware of them. You know, the ink blot ones. Undermining its objectivity and replicability. So I've linked that into the features of science again. I need to make it some sort of comparative judgment here to bring it together. So, overall, the behaviorist approach is therefore more scientifically credible as an approach to psychology. Again, look at that comparative language there, more scientifically credible. Okay, so that's my first comparison point. And let's look at the second one. So, however, one similarity between the two is their stance on free will. So I've picked up on the idea that they're both determinist, okay? Behaviorists such as Skinner are known for arguing that free will is an illusion and that behavior can be explained by understanding an individual's reinforcement history. Environmental determinism, okay? So that is some more specialist terminology in there, okay? Similarly, the psychodynamic approach argues that behavior is the result of unconscious drives and conflict, and that's known as psychic determinism. Again, more terminology. Thus, despite arguing for different causes of behavior, both approaches adopt a hard determinist perspective. So that's quite a good comparison there, because I'm acknowledging that they're not saying the same thing, yeah, because there's different types of determinism there, but I am saying they both reject free will. They're hard determinist. Okay? Okay, so let's look at doing one more. I'm quite happy with what I've done so far. I think 3 will probably be okay here. Okay, so remembering that structure again, a further difference between these approaches is their stance on the nature-nurture debate. So again, there's my theme. Behaviorism argues that nurture is the single most important factor, focusing on stimulus-response associations and consequences, or learning. In contrast, so there's the comparative language again, the psychodynamic approach acknowledges the role of nature. For example, the id, which is the primitive and instinctive part of our personality, is present at birth, according to Freud. So that's the nature side of it. Despite this, I'm going to take this a bit further. Despite this, the psychodynamic approach also acknowledges nurture. For example, the behavior of the same-sex parent is crucial in the development of the superego. So that's about when they identify with the same-sex parent and they inherit their superego that way. Yeah. So what I'm saying here, my judgment is overall, the psychodynamic approach accounts for both nature and nurture, which arguably makes it more comprehensive or more complete than the behaviorist approach. Yeah, so there's pros and cons both ways. So we've talked a lot about approaches so far. We did do a bit of biopsych, but a lot about approaches. But like I said, it doesn't just come in approaches. So here are a few other questions from paper 3 that it might be worth thinking about. I know that these are from optional topics, and so you might not do these topics. That's fair enough. Chances are you do at least one of them. Probably schizophrenia. That's pretty common. But the same thing applies for any of the optional topics. You can be asked to compare pretty much anywhere, okay? So don't get caught out by questions like this. If you have a look at the last one in particular, I think it's just worth mentioning the difference in the style of question. So the last one I've got there is discuss biological therapies for schizophrenia, or that could be for, I don't know, stress, eating, just whatever you like, okay? In your response, make comparisons with one other form of treating or managing schizophrenia. So that's quite different in the way that question is set up compared to the other two, and compared indeed to the approaches questions that we looked at before, because it is a 16-mark discuss question. So the marks will be for knowledge and for discussion, for evaluation, right? But it says that you have to make comparisons. So what you can do there is you could just have one of your evaluation paragraphs, one of your discussion paragraphs, be a comparison paragraph, and that would be fine, as long as you've done it somewhere. Or you could make the whole thing a bit more comparative. So when you're writing your discussion, you could be saying about how effective drug therapy is, but it's not as effective as CBT because, or it's more effective than CBT or more appropriate than CBT because. So you're doing your discussion, but in a more comparative way. So you're hitting that element of the question. So just look out for the different styles of question and be really confident that you've read it carefully so you know, is it 10 marks for comparison or is it actually 10 marks for discussion and evaluation, and just in there I need to do some comparison? Yeah? Hopefully that makes some level of sense. Right, so that brings us to the end of possibly a slightly longer video, but maybe more useful video. I'll stop comparing. It's not funny, is it? That brings us to the end. Thanks very much. I hope that was useful for you. Please do let me know if you've got any questions or comments down below. Thanks for listening and bearing with. I hope that you have a fantastic day. Good luck with it all, and I'll see you again soon.